The morning before my business trip, I stopped by my daughter's house with an early birthday gift. But the moment I reached her door, I heard her crying, "Please, stop, let me go." I forced the door open and froze. The woman I once called family was covering my daughter's mouth, whispering, "Remember this clearly. You saw nothing." I pulled her away and asked, "What are you doing?" Without saying another word, I took my daughter to my truck. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made my entire world change. Welcome to Revenge, Dad, and thank you for choosing to spend your time here. Before this family story begins, tell me in the comments what part of the world are you joining us from. Every single reply means the world to me. Please note, some elements of this story are fictional, included for storytelling and educational purposes. Names and locations are coincidental, but the truth inside the story is entirely real. The morning I drove to Beverly Hills, I had a single errand on my mind: deliver a birthday gift to my daughter before my flight to Denver. Nothing more, nothing less. I had the watch sitting in my breast pocket, tucked inside a small velvet pouch I'd had for 30 years. It was an Omega Seamaster, the one my own father had pressed into my palm the day I opened my first woodworking shop in Pasadena. The crystal was scratched. The leather band had been replaced twice, but the movement still ran clean and true, the way things built to last always do. I'd been meaning to give it to Emily for years. This morning, I finally would. My client in Denver had called at 7 a.m. to cancel, some permitting issue with the city, nothing I could fix from a plane seat. So I turned the truck around, stopped at a florist on Sunset for a small bunch of sunflowers, because Emily always kept them on her kitchen counter, and pointed myself toward the house in Beverly Hills, where my daughter lived with her husband, Mark Grayson. I pulled up to the curb at 9:30. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet that costs money: wide driveways, trimmed hedges, not a single weed daring to show itself on anyone's lawn. I cut the engine and sat there a moment, watching a mockingbird work its way through 3 different songs on the fence post across the street. I remember thinking that it was a good morning, that I was a lucky man. Then I heard Emily scream. It was not the kind of sound a father ever forgets, not a gasp or a startled cry. This was raw and choked, the sound of someone fighting to breathe through something pressed over their mouth. My hand was on the door handle before my brain had finished registering what I'd heard. I was moving up the front walk before I knew I was moving at all. The front door was unlocked. I threw it open so hard the handle punched a dent in the drywall behind it. The living room was empty. Sunlight cut across the hardwood floors in long yellow bars. The kitchen was quiet, but from somewhere deeper in the house I could hear it, a low, muffled sound. Someone struggling, someone trying to call out and being stopped from doing it. I followed the sound down the hallway. The door to the sitting room was half open. I pushed it the rest of the way. What I saw stopped my heart cold. Victoria Grayson, Mark's mother, the woman who had sat at my Thanksgiving table 4 years running, who sent Emily handwritten notes on her birthday, who smiled at me with such practiced warmth. I had almost convinced myself to trust her, had my daughter pinned against the back of an armchair. One hand was clamped hard over Emily's mouth. The other gripped Emily's shoulder with fingers like iron. Emily's eyes were wide and wild, and streaming, her whole body straining against the hold. The collar of her blouse was twisted sideways. A coffee cup had been knocked from the side table and lay shattered on the floor, a dark stain spreading into the rug. Victoria was leaning in close, her voice low and hard, and nothing like the woman I thought I knew. "You did not see anything," Victoria said, each word bitten off clean. "Say it. Say you did not see anything, and this ends right now. But if you say one word to anyone, Emily, I will make sure you regret it in ways you cannot imagine." Emily's fingers clawed at Victoria's wrist. Tears ran down her face in sheets. I crossed the room in 4 strides. "Get your hands off my daughter." My voice came out in a register I barely recognized, flat and absolute, the way a door sounds when it's been bolted shut. I grabbed Victoria by the shoulder and pulled her back hard enough that she stumbled 2 steps before catching herself on the bookcase. Victoria straightened up, and what happened to her face in the next 3 seconds was something I will never stop thinking about. The ferocity drained out of it, the grip of her jaw loosened, her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, and then, like a stage curtain falling into place, the familiar expression settled back, composed, slightly offended, faintly amused. The transformation was so fast and so complete that for one disorienting moment I almost wondered if I had misread what I'd seen. Almost. Thomas. Her voice was smooth and even touched with a little sigh of patience. I know what this looks like. But Emily has been under an enormous amount of stress lately, and she said some things that were quite alarming. I was simply trying to calm her down. That's how you calm someone down. I kept myself between Victoria and Emily, my hands at my sides, my jaw tight enough to ache. By holding them down and covering their mouth, she was hyperventilating. I was trying to help her regulate her breathing. Victoria reached up to straighten her necklace, cool as anything. If you'd been here 5 minutes ago, you would understand the context. Emily had pushed herself to her feet behind me. I could hear her breath coming in ragged pulls, feel the small, trembling heat of her as she pressed close to my back. Dad! Her voice was barely above a whisper, and it cracked on that one word in a way that made something behind my sternum twist hard. Dad, please, can we just go? We're going, I said. I did not look at Victoria again. I put my arm around Emily's shoulders and walked her out of that room, down the hall, through the front door, and into the September sunlight. I kept my hand firm on her back the whole way, feeling the shudder moving through her in waves. And I talked to her in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The weather, the mockingbird I'd seen on the fence, the sunflowers I'd left sitting on the front seat of the truck, just to give her something to hold on to, while the shaking worked its way out of her. I got her into the passenger seat. I buckled my own seatbelt. I started the engine. And then I sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel, staring at the steering wheel, breathing. Emily, I kept my voice quiet. Tell me what happened. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Her shoulders shook twice, and then she pulled in a long, unsteady breath and reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She drew out something small, a USB drive, the kind you could buy in a 3-pack at any drugstore small enough to close a fist around. She held it out to me. Her hand was trembling so badly she could barely keep it flat. I've been collecting things, she said. Her voice was thin and careful, like she was testing each word before she said it. For months, files, emails, records, things I found when I was looking for something else, and then things I went looking for on purpose after I understood what I was seeing. She swallowed. Her eyes, when she finally looked at me, were red and swollen and absolutely certain. Dad, I think they're trying to take everything you built. I looked at the drive sitting in her palm. I looked at my daughter's face. I reached out and took it. I did not open the USB drive right away. I sat in the truck outside my daughter's house in Beverly Hills with that small piece of plastic in my hand, and I made myself breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way Margaret used to remind me to do whenever I was ready to put my fist through something. Even now, 6 years after I lost her, I could still hear her voice in those moments. Steady, Tom. Just breathe and think. So I breathed, and I thought. I thought about the garage in Pasadena, where everything had started 41 years ago, when I was 27 years old and too stubborn to know what I didn't know. It had been a rental $240 a month, drafty in winter, suffocating in summer, with a concrete floor that my knees still remembered every cold morning. I'd bought my first table saw with money borrowed from my father-in-law, a quiet man named Gerald, who had pressed the check into my hand without ceremony and said only, "Pay me back when you cannot before." I had paid him back inside of 18 months. He'd cried when I handed him the envelope. I hadn't understood why at the time. Miller Woodcraft had grown the way most things grow, when someone refuses to let them die slowly, stubbornly, and with a great deal of pain. The first 5 years were the kind of lean that teaches you exactly what you are made of. Margaret worked the front desk of a dental office during the day and kept our books at the kitchen table every night, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a cup of tea cooling at her elbow. She never once told me to quit. She never once suggested that maybe we should cut our losses, find something safer, something steadier. She just kept doing the math and telling me what it meant, and when the numbers were bad, she would say, "We've seen worse," even in the early years when we hadn't. By the time Emily was born, we had 6 employees and a real lease on a real building in Glendale. By the time Emily started kindergarten, we had 30. By the time she graduated from USC with a business degree and walked into my office on her first day of work, wearing her mother's old blazer and her own particular brand of quiet confidence, Miller Woodcraft employed 300 people across 2 facilities and held contracts with some of the largest commercial developers on the West Coast. Margaret did not live to see that day. The cancer had taken her 4 years before moving fast and without mercy once it had made up its mind. The last thing she had said to me that made any real sense was in the hospital 3 days before the end, when she had gripped my hand hard enough to leave marks and said, "Don't you dare let go of what we built. You promised me." I had promised, and I had kept it. Emily was the reason I had kept it. She had taken to the work the way I had always secretly hoped she would not, just because it was the family business, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely loved the craft of it, the problem solving, the relationship with materials and with clients, the knowledge that the things we made would outlast all of us. She had become CEO 3 years ago, and under her leadership, we had expanded into residential custom furniture, for the first time, a market neither of us had touched before, and it had grown faster than either of us had projected. Mark Grayson had come into Emily's life 8 years ago at a trade conference in San Francisco. I had wanted to like him. I truly had. He was sharp and well-read, and he could hold a conversation about almost anything, which I've always respected. When Emily told me she was serious about him, I had done what any father does. I had watched carefully and kept my opinion close until I had enough information to form one worth having. And what I had seen over those first 2 years had seemed all right. He was attentive to Emily. He worked hard, or appeared to. When I offered him a position at the company, he accepted with what looked like genuine gratitude. But there had always been something, a quality I couldn't name precisely, a way he had of listening to conversations at dinner that made me feel like he was filing information rather than simply participating. A way he smiled when he thought no one was paying attention that didn't quite match the smile he used when he knew they were. I had put it down to my own stubbornness, an old man's reluctance to share his daughter with anyone. I had told myself I was being unfair. And then there was Victoria. Victoria Grayson had practiced corporate law in Manhattan for 25 years before she retired and relocated to California to be closer to Mark after his father passed. She was impeccably put together in the way that some people use as armor. Never a hair out of place, never a sentence that wandered, never an expression that gave away more than she intended. She had been perfectly pleasant to me in every social setting we had shared. Perfectly pleasant and perfectly unreachable. I remembered the first time she had asked about the company's ownership structure. It had been at a dinner at Emily and Mark's house about 18 months ago. A casual question slipped in between the main course and dessert. Something about how founder-led companies typically handle succession planning, whether I had thought about formalizing the transition, whether the current charter addressed those contingencies. I had answered her the way you answer questions at dinner, generally briefly without much thought. She had nodded and moved the conversation along, and I had forgotten about it by the time I reached my truck. Sitting outside that house now, with the September sun climbing toward noon and my daughter's USB drive in my palm, I felt the memory land differently than it ever had before. My chest tightened the way wood tightens before it splits along a hidden grain. The question hadn't been curiosity. It had been reconnaissance. Victoria had been mapping the territory 18 months ago, and I had handed her the map without a second thought. The realization moved through me slowly, the way cold water moves, not all at once, but finding every channel, filling every space. I looked down at the USB drive in my hand. For a moment, I couldn't make myself move. My mind was still arranging what I knew into a shape I could look at directly. 40 years of work, 300 people, Emily's life, Margaret's promise, the garage in Pasadena with the drafty walls and the concrete floor where everything had started. All of it sitting in this drive that my daughter had smuggled out of her own house with shaking hands while her mother-in-law held her down. I pulled my laptop from the back seat. I opened it. My fingers were steadier than I expected when I pressed the drive into the port. The screen blinked once, a folder opened, and I began to read. The first email loaded, and the sender's name stopped the air in my lungs. Mark Grayson. To Victoria Grayson. Subject line, Phase 2. Ready to move. The email was not long. That was the first thing that struck me, how few words it took to describe the destruction of something that had taken 40 years to build. Mark had written to his mother in the clipped, efficient shorthand of a man who had stopped pretending to feel things he didn't feel. No preamble, no softening. Just 5 lines that laid out where they were in the process, what remained to be done, and a single instruction at the bottom that read, "Make sure Hale has everything he needs before the board meeting. We don't get a second chance at this." I read it twice. Then I opened the next file. Emily had organized everything with the same methodical care she brought to the company's quarterly reports folders, nested inside, folders each one labeled in her neat, precise handwriting. Financial records, correspondence, audio files, legal documents. She had been doing this for months, working alone, saying nothing, carrying all of it inside her, while she smiled at dinner and answered Mark's questions about her day, and sat across the table from Victoria at family gatherings. The thought of it made my throat close. I clicked on the financial records first. What I found there was the kind of evidence that doesn't leave room for alternative explanations. A series of wire transfers, each one originating from an account registered to a limited liability company called Apex Interiors, a name I recognized as a mid-sized commercial furniture competitor based in Century City. The transfers moved through a shell company incorporated in Delaware, a state known for its minimal disclosure requirements, and from there into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands registered under the name GV Holdings. 2 letters, G and V, Grayson, Victoria. They had not even bothered to be creative about it. The amounts were not small. Over 14 months, the total came to just over $800,000, paid out in increments calculated, I realized, to stay just below the reporting thresholds that would have triggered automatic scrutiny from federal banking regulators. Whoever had structured the payments knew exactly what they were doing. That kind of knowledge did not come from Mark, who was competent enough, but had never shown any particular sophistication about financial concealment. It came from Victoria, who had spent 25 years practicing corporate law in Manhattan and knew every seam in the regulatory framework. I opened the correspondence folder next. The emails between Mark and Victoria spanned nearly 2 years. Reading them felt like watching a building being demolished from the inside. Each message another support beam knocked out another section of something I had trusted coming apart at its joints. They discussed the design files in the language of logistics, referring to Miller Woodcraft's proprietary custom furniture plans as the inventory, and the transfers to Apex Interiors as deliveries. They discussed me in the language of a problem to be managed. One email from Mark dated 11 months ago read, "The old man is still sharp enough to notice if we move too fast. Keep the timeline conservative. Once Hale has the board secured and the medical documentation in place, we won't need to be careful anymore. Medical documentation." I sat with those 2 words for a long moment. My hands had gone very still on the keyboard. Outside the truck, a gardener was running a leaf blower somewhere down the block, and the sound of it reached me as if from a great distance. I clicked on the legal documents folder. What I found there required me to read slowly and carefully, because the language was dense and the implications were significant. Victoria had retained Richard Hale, a corporate attorney with offices in Century City, to prepare a filing based on a clause buried in Miller Woodcraft's original corporate charter. The clause in question was what attorneys call an incapacity provision. It allowed the board of directors to remove a founding officer from their position if that officer could be demonstrated through documented medical evidence to be no longer capable of fulfilling their responsibilities. It was a standard clause. Most corporate charters written in the 80s included some version of it, a safeguard against the possibility of a founder becoming genuinely incapacitated. No one ever expected it to be weaponized. Hale had spent the past several months quietly approaching individual board members, presenting a carefully assembled picture of a man whose judgment was slipping, missed details, forgotten commitments, moments of confusion in meetings that Sandra had mentioned to me in passing, as nothing more than the ordinary fatigue of a man who worked too hard. In Hale's version, those moments were evidence of cognitive decline. He had also arranged for a private physician to prepare an evaluation based on second-hand accounts. The evaluation had not been completed yet, but it was coming. If the filing went through, I would be removed from my own company without a single criminal charge ever being filed. No fraud, no scandal, just a quiet procedural vote conducted entirely within the bounds of the law. While I was still trying to figure out what had hit me, I closed the folder. I opened the audio files. There were 3 of them. Emily had recorded them on her personal phone in the study of her own home, the room she used as a private office on evenings when Mark and Victoria had been talking in the kitchen, directly below, and their voices had carried up through the vent in the floor. She had noted in a text file attached to the folder that she had used her own device and her own accounts for all of her collecting, specifically because she did not trust the company's systems. She had been right not to. I put in my earbuds and pressed play on the first file. Mark's voice came through clearly, the familiar cadence of it, now carrying a quality I could not name, something underneath the words that I had heard 100 times without understanding what I was hearing. "She's going to be a problem," Mark said. "She's been poking around in the transfer records. I can see her access history." Victoria's voice was quieter, but the clarity was enough. "How much does she know?" "Not enough yet, but she's smart. She'll get there if we give her time." "Then we don't give her time." A pause, the sound of a chair scraping. "Richard is ready to move on the board, filing the moment we say so. Once her father is out, Emily loses her standing. No one will listen to the CEO installed by a man the board has just voted incompetent. And Emily herself. Emily and Victoria said, will learn to adjust to the new circumstances. She doesn't have a choice." My hand was shaking when I pulled the earbud out, not from weakness, from the particular kind of rage that moves slowly through a man's body when he has been patient for too long about something he should have seen sooner. I looked at Emily sitting in the passenger seat beside me. She had her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, her face turned toward the window. She had stopped crying, but the tracks of it were still visible on her face, and her lower lip was trembling in small, involuntary pulses that she was clearly trying to control and couldn't quite manage. "How long have you known?" I asked. She turned to look at me. Her eyes were swollen nearly shut. "About 7 months," she said. "I found the first transfer by accident when I was auditing a supplier account. I thought it was a mistake. I went back to check, and it wasn't a mistake." She pulled in a breath that shuddered on the way in. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid of what would happen if I said something before I had enough to prove it. I was afraid you'd confront Mark directly and they'd destroy everything before we could document it." "You were protecting me," I said. "I was trying to." Her voice broke on the last word, and she pressed her hand over her mouth hard, squeezing her eyes shut. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have come to you sooner. I needed it to be enough. I needed it to actually be enough before I brought it to you. Emily," I waited until she looked at me. "You did the right thing. Every part of it. You hear me?" She nodded, but her chin was trembling too hard to be convincing. My phone buzzed on the center console. An unknown number. I answered it. "Mr. Miller." The voice was Sandra Kowalski, my assistant of 22 years, the woman who had opened the office every morning before I arrived, and who knew the filing system of Miller Woodcraft better than I knew my own house. Her voice was barely above a whisper, tight with something I had never heard from her before. "Mr. Miller, I don't know how to tell you this. They just served papers to the board. You're being investigated for selling proprietary trade secrets to a competitor. There's going to be an emergency meeting. They're saying it was you." The leaf blower down the street had stopped. The neighborhood was absolutely quiet. "Sandra," I said, "don't say anything to anyone. Not yet. I'll call you back within the hour." I ended the call. I set the phone down on the console. I looked out through the windshield at the long, clean street, at the trimmed hedges, and the wide driveways, at the life that money builds around itself to keep the rest of the world out. Then I started the engine. I drove to the office on Wilshire Boulevard with both hands on the wheel, and my jaw set so tight I could feel the ache spreading up into my temples. Sandra met me in the lobby. Her face was the color of old paper, and when she saw me come through the glass doors, she pressed her hand flat against her sternum like she was trying to hold something in. "They're already in the boardroom," she said. "Mr. Miller, I'm so sorry. I didn't know until an hour ago. They went around me completely." I put my hand briefly on her shoulder. "It's not your fault. Go back to your desk and don't say a word to anyone." She nodded, her eyes bright with tears she was refusing to let fall. The boardroom was on the 14th floor. I took the elevator up alone, watching the numbers climb, and I made myself think clearly about what I was walking into. They had moved faster than I had expected, which told me the filing with the board had been ready for some time, waiting only for the right moment. This morning had been the right moment. They thought I was on a plane to Denver. They thought they had the whole day to manage the narrative before I landed. They had not counted on a canceled meeting. I pushed open the boardroom door. The room went quiet the moment I stepped inside. 9 faces turned toward me, board members I had known for decades, men and women who had watched this company grow from a regional operation into something that mattered. Not one of them met my eyes directly. They looked at the table, at their folders, at their hands. Gerald Whitmore, who had been on the board for 18 years and once told me I was the most honest man he'd ever done business with, found something extremely interesting to study on the far wall. Mark sat at the far end of the table. He had dressed carefully for this dark suit, no tie, the studied informality of a man who wanted to appear reluctant rather than triumphant. When I walked in, he pressed his lips together and looked down at the table, and the performance of it, the practiced grief of it, sent a hot rush of something through my chest that I had to breathe against carefully. Victoria sat to his left. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer and a single strand of pearls, and her expression was one I recognized, the composed sorrow of someone who has prepared themselves to deliver difficult news. She did not look at me when I entered. Richard Hale sat beside her. He was a trim man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of careful stillness that expensive lawyers cultivate. He had a leather portfolio open in front of him and a pen in his hand that he was not using. "Thomas," Mark's voice was low and carefully modulated. "I'm glad you're here. I know this isn't easy, but we had a responsibility to the board." "Then let's hear it," I said. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, my chair, the one I had sat in for 20 years, and I sat down. "Go ahead, Richard." Hale cleared his throat. He presented the case methodically, the way good lawyers do, building the structure before you see the conclusion coming. Email records bearing my name, wire transfer authorizations with my digital signature, a bank account in my name at a private institution in Nevada that I had never heard of and certainly never opened. It was well done. I had to give them that. Whoever had built the false documentation had been thorough and patient, and if I had been anyone else sitting in that chair, I might have believed it myself. Mark spoke when Hale finished. His voice cracked on the second sentence, and he stopped, pressed 2 fingers against his mouth, collected himself. "I want to be clear," he said, "that bringing this forward is the hardest thing I have ever done. Thomas has been like a father to me, but I have a responsibility to this company and to the people who depend on it." Someone at the table made a low sound of sympathy. I could not tell who. Victoria reached across and touched Mark's arm. "We all know how difficult this is," she said softly. "But the evidence speaks for itself." The vote took 4 minutes, 7 in favor of temporary suspension of my authority as chairman pending investigation, 2 abstentions, 0 votes in my defense. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I looked at the room one last time, at Gerald Whitmore, who was still studying the wall, at the people I had hired and mentored and trusted, at the table I had built with my own hands 15 years ago, from a single slab of black walnut that had taken 3 men to carry up in the elevator. I walked out without a word. In the elevator going down, I stood very straight and kept my breathing even. The lobby was busy with the ordinary mid-morning movement of people doing ordinary work, and I moved through it without stopping and pushed through the glass doors into the September heat. My truck was where I had left it. I got in. I sat there looking up at the building, 14 floors of glass and steel, with my name on the directory in the lobby, and I felt something move through me that was not despair and was not defeat. It was older and quieter than either of those things. It was the recognition of a man who has built something from nothing, and knows in his bones that the people trying to take it from him have made a serious mistake. They had moved too fast. The documentation was too clean. And clean documentation, in my experience, always has seams. I started the engine. I knew exactly who I needed to call. I called Daniel Ortega from the parking garage beneath the Wilshire building, sitting in my truck with the engine running and the phone pressed hard against my ear. He picked up on the second ring. "Tom." His voice was the same as it had always been, unhurried, slightly graveled, with the particular quality of a man who has heard bad news often enough that it no longer surprises him. "You sound like something went sideways." "Something went sideways," I said. A pause. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need you in person, not on the phone." Another pause, shorter this time. "Santa Monica Pier, the coffee place on the South End. Give me 40 minutes. He was already there when I arrived. Daniel Ortega was 70 years old, and looked it in the way that certain men look their age, not diminished by it, but marked by it, the way old timber gets marked by weather. He had retired from the FBI 12 years ago, after 22 years in their financial crimes division, where he had spent the better part of 2 decades untangling the kind of fraud that corporate lawyers spend their careers learning to construct. Now, he ran a small private consulting practice out of an office in Culver City, and took cases that interested him, which meant cases that were complicated enough to be worth his time. We had met 35 years ago when he was a young agent investigating a supplier fraud case that had touched one of my early contracts. He had cleared me inside of a week and then shown up at my shop in Glendale afterward to apologize in person for the inconvenience, which was not something federal agents typically did. We had been friends ever since. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him, and a second one waiting across the table when I sat down. "Talk," he said. I talked. I laid out everything. The USB drive, the emails, the wire transfers, the GV Holdings account in the Cayman Islands, the incapacity filing, Richard Hale, the board vote that morning. I talked for 20 minutes without stopping, and Daniel sat with both hands wrapped around his cup and listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't know what to say. The quiet of a man who is organizing what he has just heard into the categories that matter. "Wire fraud," he said finally. 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. Every one of those transfers moved through interstate banking channels, which puts it squarely in federal territory. The trade secret theft is 18 U.S.C. Section 1832, that's the Defend Trade Secrets Act. If they transmitted those design files electronically across state lines, and they almost certainly did, that's federal jurisdiction as well. He set his cup down. "Tom, this isn't a civil matter. This is criminal, and it's serious enough that the people who did it should be genuinely afraid right now." "They're not afraid," I said. "They think they've already won." "Good." Something moved across Daniel's face, not quite a smile, but close to it. "Overconfident people make mistakes. Frightened people cover their tracks. You want them overconfident for as long as possible." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Now, the name Apex Interiors. Tell me exactly what the transfers said." I told him. He sat back slowly. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition careful and controlled, the kind that comes from connecting something new to something already known. "I've heard that name," he said. My chest tightened. "What do you mean you've heard it?" 3 years ago, I did a consultation for a manufacturing firm in San Diego. Mid-sized operation, custom millwork, family-owned. They lost 2 major contracts to a competitor and couldn't figure out how the competitor had gotten access to their proprietary bid structures. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. The money trail led to a purchasing intermediary that had connections to a company called Apex Interiors. We couldn't build a complete case because the client ran out of resources to pursue it, but the pattern was there. He looked at me steadily. "Tom Miller Woodcraft is not the first company these people have done this to. This is a system. Victoria Grayson didn't build it for you. She adapted it." The sound of the Pacific came through the open side of the cafe, steady and different, moving the way it always moves, regardless of what is happening on the shore. "How many companies?" I asked. "I don't know. More than one. Possibly more than half a dozen." He folded his hands on the table, "which means there may be other people out there who have pieces of this that we don't have yet. And it means that when this comes apart, and it is going to come apart, it is going to come apart in a way that is much larger than just your situation." I pressed my thumb and forefinger against the bridge of my nose and held them there for a moment. 41 years of work. Margaret's promise. Emily in the passenger seat of my truck, with her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold a USB drive flat. "What do I do?" I asked. "3 things," Daniel said. He held up one finger. "You let them think they've won. No confrontations, no threats, no letting them see that you know what you know. You become the tired old man they want you to be." Second finger. "Emily keeps collecting from the inside, but only from her personal devices, nothing connected to the company network. If they have an IT person monitoring the system, and they probably do, she can't leave any tracks." Third finger. "I start pulling on the financial thread from the outside. Shell companies leave records. Offshore accounts leave records. Everything leaves records, Tom, if you know where to look and you're patient enough to follow the paper." He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down, with the mild expression of a man who has learned not to be surprised when things run out. "Can you do that?" he asked. "Can you let them think they've won?" I thought about the boardroom, about Gerald Whitmore staring at the wall, about Mark's practice crack in his voice, and Victoria's pearl necklace, and the black walnut table I had carried up 14 floors. "I built a company from nothing, Daniel," I said. "I can do anything I need to do." He nodded once slowly with the weight of a man who has known me long enough to believe it. "Then let's go get your company back," he said. Sandra Kowalski lived in a small house in Glendale, 12 minutes from the office, in a neighborhood of older homes with good trees and narrow driveways and neighbors who still waved at each other across the street. She had lived there for 19 years, ever since her divorce, raising her son alone in the house with the blue shutters and the rose bushes along the front walk that she tended with a dedication she rarely applied to anything that wasn't worth keeping. I had been to her home exactly twice before, once for her son's graduation party 11 years ago, and once to drop off a document she needed on a Sunday afternoon. Both times she had met me at the door with the particular warmth of someone who draws a clear line between work and home, and is quietly pleased when the right people are allowed to cross it. This time, she opened the door before I had finished knocking. She looked like she had aged 5 years since that morning. The neat professional composure she wore at the office every day had come apart. At the edges, her blouse was untucked on one side. Her reading glasses were pushed up on her head at an angle that suggested she had forgotten they were there, and her eyes were red and swollen in the way that comes from crying that has been going on for some time and keeps starting again every time it stops. "Come in," she said. Her voice was barely holding together. "Please come in." The living room was small and carefully arranged, the kind of room where every object had a history. Family photographs covered one wall in mismatched frames. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the coffee table, long cold. She had been sitting here alone, I realized, waiting. She sat down on the edge of the couch and pressed both hands flat on her knees. I took the chair across from her. "Sandra," I said, "tell me what you know." She pulled in a breath so deep her whole body shook with it. Then she pressed her lips together, looked at the floor, looked back up at me, and began. "8 months ago," she said. "I noticed it 8 months ago. Someone had submitted a facilities request to have new equipment installed in your private conference room on the executive floor. The request came through as a standard security upgrade, new smoke detector, updated lighting panel. I processed it because it came with the right authorization codes, and I didn't think anything of it." Her hands tightened on her knees. "Last month, I found out those authorization codes had been generated from Mark's computer, not from facilities, from Mark's computer." I kept my face still. "What kind of equipment, Sandra?" She met my eyes, and hers were filled with something that looked like shame so deep it had become physical. "Cameras," she said. "Mr. Miller, they put cameras in your conference room, in the smoke detector housing, and in the light panel. Everything you discussed in that room for the past 8 months, every negotiation, every strategy meeting, every private conversation, they were watching all of it." The room felt very quiet. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. My voice came out gentler than I expected, which surprised me because what I felt in that moment was not gentle. It was a cold, focused fury that I was keeping at a careful distance from everything I said. Sandra's face crumpled. She pressed one hand over her mouth, and her shoulders shook twice hard before she got herself back under control. "Because I was afraid," she said. Her voice was muffled behind her hand. "I know how that sounds. I know it's not an excuse. But Mark called me into his office 3 weeks after I figured it out, and he didn't say anything directly. He never says anything directly, but he made it very clear that people who created problems for the transition would find themselves without references, without severance, without anything." She lowered her hand. Her chin was trembling. "I'm 55 years old, Mr. Miller. I've worked at this company for 22 years. I don't have another job to go to. I don't have a pension outside of what I've built there. I was scared, and I did the wrong thing, and I have not slept properly in 6 weeks because of it." I leaned forward and put my hand over hers. "Sandra?" I waited until she looked at me. "I'm not here to make you feel worse about a decision you already know was wrong. I'm here because I need your help, and I think you need to give it. Not for me, for yourself. Because the people who threatened you are not going to protect you when this comes apart, and it is going to come apart." She stared at me for a long moment. Her eyes were searching my face for something, certainty maybe, or the specific quality of conviction that tells you a person means what they say. Whatever she found there made her exhale slowly, like a pressure valve being released. "What do you need?" she asked. "The access logs," I said. "Every entry and exit record for the company's IT system for the past 14 months. Who accessed what files from which devices at what times. Can you get those without triggering a flag?" "Yes." She sat up slightly straighter, and I watched the professional Sandra reassemble herself over the frightened one, the way a person pulls on a coat they've worn for 22 years and remembers the shape of themselves inside it. I have administrative access to the archive system. Mark doesn't know that. He changed the active system permissions 8 months ago, but he didn't touch the archive. Good. I also need you to be prepared to make a formal statement. Not yet, not until I tell you it's time. But when the moment comes, everything you've told me tonight needs to be on the record. She nodded. Her hands had stopped shaking. I'll do it, she said quietly. Whatever you need, I should have done it 6 weeks ago. You're doing it now, I said. That's what matters. I stood to leave, and she walked me to the door. On the front porch, she caught my arm, and when I turned, she was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, something stripped of the professional distance that had defined 22 years of working lunches and quarterly reports and early mornings in a shared office. Mr. Miller, she said, I am so sorry for all of it. I know you are, I said. I drove home through the Glendale streets with the windows down, the September night air, moving through the truck cab, thinking about what it costs a person to stay quiet about something they know is wrong and what it costs them differently to finally speak. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me. A text from Sandra sent 3 minutes after I had left her driveway. Mr. Miller, Mark just came to my house. He knocked on the door. I didn't answer, but I could hear him outside for almost 10 minutes. He knows we met. I pulled over. I sat there with the phone in my hand and the engine running. Then I called Daniel. Daniel arrived at my house in Santa Monica 40 minutes after I called him. I had the coffee going by the time he knocked, and I had the laptop open on the kitchen table with Sandra's archive files already downloading onto an encrypted drive Daniel had couriered to me 2 days earlier with a note that said, "Only use this. Nothing else." He came through the door, dropped his jacket over a chair, looked at the screen, and sat down without a word of greeting. That was how we worked, the two of us, when there was actual work to be done. Mark went to Sandra's house tonight, I said. Stood outside for 10 minutes after she didn't answer. Daniel's jaw tightened. Witness intimidation. That's a separate criminal count. Documented time date Sandra's account in writing. He pulled the laptop toward him. Has she put anything in writing yet? She'll send me a written statement tomorrow morning. Good. Tell her to include every detail. What time he arrived, how long he stayed, whether he said anything she could hear through the door. All of it. He was already scrolling through the files. Let's see what Sandra pulled for us. The access logs were more detailed than I had hoped. Sandra's archive system had captured 26 months of IT activity. Every login, every file, access every upload and download, timestamped to the second and tied to a specific device ID. Daniel pulled up a spreadsheet program and began sorting the data while I refilled both our cups and stood at the counter watching him work. There, he said 20 minutes in. He pointed at the screen without looking up. March 14th. 3:47 in the morning. Device ID ending in 8842. That's Mark's work laptop, logged in remotely from a residential IP address registered to the Beverly Hills property. He kept scrolling. He accessed 47 files in the proprietary design folder. The Miller Heritage Collection, the Coastal Contract Series, the modular system you were developing for the Downtown Hotel project. All of it. He downloaded every single one. I pulled a chair up beside him and looked at the screen. The timestamps were there in plain black type, 3:47 a.m., 3:51 a.m., 3:58 a.m. A quiet, methodical theft, conducted in the middle of the night while the building sat empty and the city slept. He thought no one would ever look at the archive, I said. Most people don't, Daniel said. The active system is what IT departments monitor. The archive exists for compliance purposes, and nobody touches it for years at a time. Mark was thorough enough to cover his tracks on the active system. He didn't think about the archive because he didn't know it had administrative access Sandra had held since the original system installation. He made a note on the yellow legal pad he'd brought in his jacket pocket. Now let's look at Hale. He opened a second window and began running Richard Hale's name through a series of professional databases he accessed through his consulting firm's subscription. What came back was useful. Hale had been practicing corporate law in California for 23 years, most of it in Century City. His record was largely clean, with one significant exception, a formal censure from the California State Bar in 2019 for conduct involving a client matter in which he had, according to the bar's findings, prepared documentation he knew to be misleading in order to influence a board of directors' vote. He had not been disbarred. He had paid a fine and completed an ethics course and continued practicing. But the record was there. He's done this before, I said. A version of it, Daniel agreed. He knows how to walk the line. He knows exactly how far he can go before it becomes something the bar can't ignore. The question is whether what he's prepared for Victoria crosses that line far enough to matter. He leaned back in his chair and stretched his neck to one side. I'm going to pull on the GV Holdings thread tomorrow. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands are designed to be difficult to trace, but they're not impossible. Every account has a registered agent, and registered agents leave records, and records leave trails. It takes time, and it takes patience, but it comes apart eventually. My phone buzzed on the table. Emily, I answered immediately. Are you all right? I'm fine. Her voice was low and careful, the voice she used when Mark was somewhere in the house. I'm in my office with the door locked. I found something I thought you should know about tonight. The sound of fingers moving on a keyboard. I've been going back through the supplier communications from the past 18 months, and I found a pattern in the response times. Every time we submitted a sealed bid to a commercial developer, Apex Interiors submitted a competing bid within 72 hours. Every time Dad, 14 bids over 16 months. The probability of that being coincidental is essentially zero. I pressed my hand flat on the kitchen table. They were feeding Apex our bid structures in real time. Yes, and I think I know how. There's a vendor communications portal we use for contractor submissions. It routes through the company server, but the access isn't monitored the same way the design files are. Someone with the right credentials could pull bid documents from that portal without triggering any of the standard alerts. A pause. I didn't use the company system to find this. I pulled the bid submission records from the developer portals directly. They were public record. I matched the dates myself. Smart, I said, and I meant it with everything I had. Emily, send me the dates in a document from your personal account. Nothing through the company system. Already done, she said. Dad. A pause longer this time. Be careful. Mark has been watching me tonight. I can feel it. I know. We're moving as fast as we can. I kept my voice steady the way you keep a hand steady when someone needs to take hold of it. Lock your office door and don't engage with him tonight. I'll call you in the morning. After I ended the call, I set the phone down and looked at Daniel. He had heard my side of the conversation and was already pulling up the bid submission records Emily had mentioned. 14 bids, he said, 72 hours each time. Every single one. He whistled low through his teeth, the sound a man makes when something is worse than he expected and better than he feared, because at least it is provable. That's not circumstantial anymore, Tom. That is a pattern of conduct that a federal prosecutor could stand up in court and explain to a jury in 20 minutes. He turned back to the screen and kept working, pulling data from one window, cross-referencing against another. Building. The case the way I had once built furniture, piece by piece, joint by joint. Nothing moving forward until the previous piece was solid. It was past 2 a.m. when Daniel finally pushed back from the table and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. He stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at the laptop screen and went very still. Tom, he said. His voice had changed. I looked up from the legal pad where I had been writing notes. There's a third account, he said. He turned the laptop so I could see the screen. A transaction log different from the GV Holdings records routed through a separate shell company with a different registered agent. Smaller amounts nowhere near the scale of the Victoria payments, but consistent. Monthly. Going back 19 months. Someone else inside your company is getting paid, Daniel said. And it isn't Mark. I stared at the screen. The coffee had gone cold in both our cups, and neither of us had noticed. We worked through what remained of the night. By 4 a.m, we had a name. The third account was registered to a consulting firm called Parsons Technical Solutions, a sole proprietorship filed with the California Secretary of State 14 months ago, with a business address that turned out to be a UPS store on Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena. The registered owner was Kevin Parsons. I sat back in my chair and felt something move through me that was not quite surprise and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. Kevin Parsons was 34 years old. He had come to Miller Woodcraft 2 years ago with a resume that was genuinely impressive. A computer science degree from Cal Poly, 4 years at a cybersecurity firm in San Jose, a list of certifications that Daniel had to look up, because neither of us recognized half of them. He had interviewed exceptionally well. He had started as a senior network administrator, and within 8 months had been promoted to IT manager, a position I had approved personally after Sandra told me he was the most technically capable person she had seen come through the company in a decade. I had shaken his hand on the day of his promotion. I had told him I expected great things. "He's the one who installed the cameras," Daniel said. It was not a question. "He's the one who installed the cameras," I confirmed. My voice came out flat. "He's the one who created the false email records. He's the one who generated the digital signatures. Everything that required technical execution, Kevin did it. Mark recruited him." "Mark recruited him," I said. "And now Mark is going to let him take the fall for it." Daniel closed the laptop. He looked at me across the table with the expression he used when he was about to say something he had already decided needed to be said plainly. "I need to talk to him," Daniel said. "Not you, me, alone without lawyers, without warnings, before he has time to lawyer up on Mark's recommendation and disappear into a story someone else has written for him." He folded his hands on the table. "Will you let me handle this?" "He's my employee," I said. "He's a 34-year-old man who got in over his head and doesn't know yet that the people who put him there have already decided he's expendable. If I talk to him right, he'll tell us everything. If you talk to him, he'll panic and call Mark within the hour." I looked at the ceiling. I thought about Kevin Parsons standing in my office 2 years ago, trying not to show how pleased he was about the promotion and managing it about as well as a 20-something manages anything they want very badly. "Handle it," I said. Daniel reached Kevin the next afternoon at a coffee shop in Burbank Neutral Ground, far enough from the office that no one from the company would see them, close enough to Kevin's apartment that he had agreed to the meeting without requiring a reason beyond Daniel describing himself as an independent consultant looking into some irregularities in Miller Woodcraft's IT infrastructure. I was not there. Daniel called me 2 hours later. "He showed up," Daniel said. "Sat down across from me, ordered a black coffee, and spent the first 10 minutes trying to figure out exactly how much I knew. He's smart, Tom. Genuinely smart. He was measuring everything I said." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth. I told him what we had found, what it meant legally, and what was going to happen to him, specifically when federal investigators got involved, which they would because wire fraud and trade secret theft are federal crimes, and the FBI does not negotiate those down to misdemeanors." A pause. And then I told him something he clearly had not considered. "What?" "I told him to look at the structure of what Mark had built. Kevin had technical access. Kevin had executed every piece of the operation that required someone to actually touch a keyboard. The emails were generated from systems Kevin administered. The camera installation was authorized with credentials only Kevin could have created. The false documentation bore digital signatures that traced back to workstations Kevin controlled." Daniel's voice was careful and deliberate. Mark Grayson, on the other hand, had sent emails from his personal account to his mother. That's it. Everything else had Kevin's fingerprints on it, and Kevin's fingerprints only. When this came to trial, Mark's lawyers were going to stand up in court and point at Kevin Parsons and say that a disgruntled IT employee had orchestrated the entire scheme without their client's knowledge. I said nothing. I waited. "He went pale," Daniel said. "I mean genuinely pale, the color of old concrete. He put his coffee cup down, and he stared at the table, and his hands were shaking badly enough that I could see it from across the table. And then he looked up at me and said, and I'm quoting him directly, 'He told me I was protected. He told me he'd take care of it if anything went wrong.'" My throat tightened. Mark told him that. Mark told him that. Probably 6 or 8 months ago, when Kevin was starting to understand the full scope of what he'd gotten himself into and was looking for a reason to believe it would be all right. Daniel exhaled. "He's not a bad person, Tom. He's a young man who made a catastrophic decision because someone older and more experienced told him the risk was manageable and then structured the entire operation to make sure Kevin was the one holding the bag when it wasn't." I pressed my hand flat against the kitchen counter and stared at the middle distance for a moment. "Is he going to cooperate?" I asked. I connected him with a public defender. I know a good one, someone who works federal cases and will give him honest advice instead of what he wants to hear. Kevin met with her this afternoon. She explained that cooperation agreements with federal prosecutors are real. They are common in cases exactly like this one, and that his best possible outcome by a significant margin was to provide everything he had to the FBI before the investigation reached him, rather than after. Daniel paused. He signed the cooperation paperwork this evening. The FBI has his full statement, his access credentials, his personal records of every instruction Mark gave him, and 3 months of text messages he had the sense to screenshot and save to a personal cloud account. The relief that moved through me was physical, a loosening in my chest that I hadn't realized was there until it released. "There's something else," Daniel said. His voice shifted in a way I had learned over 35 years to pay close attention to. "Kevin told me something at the end of the meeting, before his lawyer arrived. He said he needed me to understand that what Victoria and Mark had planned was not just about the company." I straightened. "What does that mean?" He overheard a conversation 3 months ago. Mark and Victoria in Mark's home office. The door wasn't fully closed, and Kevin was in the hallway. Daniel's voice was precise, and even the voice of a man delivering information he knows is going to land hard. Victoria said that once the company's situation was resolved, Emily was going to become a liability, that a woman who knew what Emily knew and who had documented what Emily had documented could not be allowed to simply continue living her life and eventually decide she wanted to talk. My hand tightened on the phone until I could feel my pulse in my palm. "Kevin's exact words," Daniel continued, were these: "Mrs. Grayson said Emily wouldn't be able to fight back, not permanently. She said there were ways to make sure of it that didn't leave the kind of evidence that causes problems." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Santa Monica night was doing what it always did. The distant sound of the Pacific, the occasional car on the street, the indifferent ordinary business of a city that did not know or care what was happening in my kitchen at 11:30 on a Tuesday. "Daniel," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended. "I know," he said. "I need to get Emily out of that house." "Yes," Daniel said. "You do." Before I reveal what Victoria had been quietly preparing for Emily, something far darker than anyone's suspected comment. The number 9 below. "So I know you're here, because once you hear this, you'll understand why Thomas did what he did next. Please know some details in this family story have been shaped for storytelling purposes and may not reflect any specific real events. If this isn't for you, you're welcome to step away, no judgment at all." I did not go home after Daniel's call. I sat in my truck in the Santa Monica driveway for a few minutes, with the engine off and the phone in my lap, and I tried to think clearly. But the word kept coming back, the same way a splinter works its way back to the surface, no matter how many times you push it down, permanently. Victoria had used that word in a conversation about my daughter, and she had used it the way people use words when they have already decided what they mean. I started the engine and drove east. The garage in Pasadena was 15 minutes away, at that hour when the freeways were quiet and the city had pulled back into itself for the night. I had kept the lease on the original space even after we moved the company to Glendale and then to Los Angeles, not for any practical reason but because Margaret had asked me to. "Don't let go of it," she had said early on, when we were still counting every dollar. "That place is where you became who you are. You might need to remember that someday." I had paid the lease for 41 years. I had never once regretted it. I unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The smell hit me the way it always did. Sawdust and machine oil, and the particular dry warmth of a space that has held decades of work inside its walls. I reached for the light switch out of habit, and then stopped and left the lights off. The streetlight outside came through the high windows in long, pale bars enough to see by. The space was mostly empty now. A workbench along one wall, a few hand tools I kept there, out of sentiment, some lumber stacked in the corner that I kept meaning to use for something and never got around to. The concrete floor had marks on it that went back 30 years, the dark stain from a can of finish that had tipped over in the summer of 1987. The groove worn into the concrete near the door, from the wheel of the first table, saw I'd ever owned a patch of floor near the east wall, where Margaret had written our daughter's name in the wet concrete when we'd had the floor resurfaced the year Emily was born. I walked to that corner and crouched down. The letters were still there. EMILY pressed into the concrete in Margaret's careful handwriting, the edges worn smooth from 4 decades of feet passing over them, but still perfectly legible. Margaret had laughed when she did it, that particular laugh she had when she was doing something she knew was slightly ridiculous and didn't care. "Now she'll always have a place here," Margaret had said, "even when she's grown and doesn't need us anymore." My throat closed. I sat down on the cold concrete floor with my back against the east wall, right next to those letters, and I put my face in my hands. I am not a man who cries easily. I had cried at Margaret's funeral privately in the bathroom of the hospital the night she passed and not in front of anyone since. I had built things, when the grief was bad, worked long hours in this garage and in the shop and in clients' homes, turning the feeling into something with edges and joints and a useful shape. It had worked mostly. It had gotten me through. But sitting on that floor in the dark with my daughter's name pressed into the concrete beside me and the knowledge of what Victoria had said about her sitting in my chest, like a stone I couldn't build anything. There was nothing to build. There was only the simple fact of what I was afraid of, stripped of every practical consideration, every plan, every next step. I was afraid of losing Emily the way I had lost Margaret, suddenly, without enough time, with things left unsaid. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, and I let it come the way you let a wave come when you are already past the point of outrunning it. My shoulders shook. My breath came apart. For 3 or 4 minutes, I sat on the concrete floor of that garage where everything had started, and I was not a founder or a chairman or a man with a plan. I was a father, 68 years old, sitting next to his daughter's name in the dark. Then, I breathed out long and slow. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I sat there for another minute listening to the garage settle around me, the way old buildings do at night. Then I picked up my phone and called Emily. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful and very low. "Dad," just that word. But the way she said it told me she had been waiting for this call. Cricket? It was the name I had called her since she was 3 years old, when she had developed a passionate attachment to the crickets that lived in the garden and had insisted on naming every one of them. I had not used it in years. It came out now without my deciding to use it. "I need you to listen to me. I need you to get out of that house tonight." A pause. The particular quality of silence that means someone is checking to make sure they cannot be overheard. "I can't," she said. Her voice dropped even lower. "Mark took my car keys 2 days ago. He said the car needed service and he'd take care of it, but the car is in the driveway and I saw the keys on his dresser this morning." A breath carefully controlled. "And my phone. I think he's reading my texts. I noticed the battery draining faster than it should, and Kevin told you about the technical side of that. If someone installed monitoring software, it would run constantly in the background." My jaw tightened until I could feel the ache spreading into my neck. "Have you been using the personal phone, the one Daniel's contacts set up?" "Yes, every time I've contacted you. Never the regular one." Another pause. "Dad, what did Kevin tell you? What does permanently mean?" I looked at the letters in the concrete beside me. EMILY. "It means I'm coming to get you," I said. "Not tonight. I need one more day to do this right, but tomorrow night. You don't need to do anything except be ready when I get there. Mark will be home. I know he will. He's going to—" "Emily." I kept my voice steady the way you keep a hand steady. "Has there ever been a single day in your life when I told you I was going to do something and then didn't do it?" A long silence, and then very quietly in a voice that cracked right down the middle, "No, Dad, there hasn't." "Then trust me one more day." I heard her exhale a long, shuddering release of breath that she had probably been holding for hours, maybe longer. "Okay," she said. "Okay, one more day." After I ended the call, I stayed on the floor for a little while longer. I thought about 41 years, about the saw marks on the workbench and the stain on the floor and the letters in the concrete, about Margaret saying, "Don't let go of it, you might need to remember someday," about what it means to build something that is meant to last and what it costs when the people closest to you decide to take it apart. Victoria Grayson had spent 2 years engineering the destruction of everything I had built. She had been patient and careful and very, very thorough. She had recruited my son-in-law, corrupted my IT manager, compromised my board, and prepared a legal mechanism to remove me from my own company without a single criminal charge. And when all of that was in place, she had turned her attention to my daughter. She had made one mistake. She thought that because I was 68 years old and worked with my hands and had not gone to the right schools or moved in the right circles, I was a man who could be managed, a man who would not see it coming until it was too late and who would not know what to do when he did. She was wrong about all of it. I stood up, brushed the concrete dust from my jeans, and walked to the door. Tomorrow night, I was bringing my daughter home. If you believe that a father's love is stronger than any scheme someone could build against it, leave the word family in the comments below. And don't go anywhere, because Thomas Miller is not finished yet. I left the house at 11:15. No phone calls, no texts. Sandra had confirmed 2 days earlier that Mark had installed monitoring software on Emily's primary device, which meant anything sent to that number went directly to him as well. The personal phone Daniel's contact had set up for Emily used a separate carrier account, with no connection to anything Mark could trace, but I didn't want to risk even that tonight. Some things you do in silence because silence is the only cover you have. I parked the truck on a residential street 2 blocks north of the Beverly Hills property, between a silver sedan and a contractor's van, unremarkable in the unremarkable way of a vehicle that belongs exactly where it is. I sat there for 3 minutes, watching the street. Nothing moved. The neighborhood was the specific quiet of very expensive houses after midnight, not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of people who have enough money to buy good insulation and sleep soundly behind it. I got out and walked south on the sidewalk, keeping my pace, even my hands in my jacket pockets. Just a man out for a late walk. Nothing to look at. The Beverly Hills house sat back from the street behind a low hedge and a wide driveway. The front of the house was dark. One light burned in an upstairs window on the east side, Mark's home office, where he kept the hours of a man with things to monitor. The bedroom window on the west side was dark, which was what I needed. I walked past the front of the property without slowing and turned down the side street. The bedroom window faced the side yard low enough from the ground that the sound would carry if you knew what you were listening for. I stopped below it, looked up. Then I knocked 3 times with my knuckle against the wooden fence post nearest the window, the same rhythm Emily and I had used when she was 14 years old, and had a habit of slipping out to meet friends after curfew, and had made her father a co-conspirator in the arrangement, by teaching him the knock so she'd know it was safe to come back. 10 seconds passed. Then the window slid open. Emily came through it the way she had at 14, efficiently without wasted motion, lowering herself to the sill and dropping the last 2 feet to the ground with a soft impact that barely disturbed the gravel. She was wearing dark clothes and had her hair pulled back, and she was carrying a laptop bag over one shoulder and nothing else. She grabbed my arm with both hands the moment her feet hit the ground. Her fingers dug in hard enough to feel through my jacket sleeve, and I could feel the trembling in them, not the fine tremor of cold, but the deep full-body shake of someone who has been holding themselves together through an act of pure will for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. "Dad," she breathed, just that, just my name. "I've got you," I said. "Walk with me, normal pace." We walked back up the side street toward the truck, side by side, her hand still on my arm. I kept my pace exactly as it had been coming down, even unhurried, belonging to the street. She matched me, step for step, the way she had always been able to read my rhythm from the time she was small enough that I carried her on my shoulders through the shop in Pasadena. We were half a block from the truck when the light in the front upstairs window went out. I did not speed up. I did not look back. "Keep walking," I said quietly. "He's awake," Emily said. Her voice was steady, but her hand tightened on my arm. "He might be. Keep walking." We reached the truck. I opened the passenger door and she got in. I walked around to the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb at the speed of a man with nowhere urgent to be. At the end of the block, I turned left. In the rearview mirror, the street behind us was empty. I let out a breath. We drove for several minutes without speaking. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people letting the adrenaline work its way out of their systems at its own pace. The city moved past the windows. Emily sat with the laptop bag in her lap, both arms wrapped around it, staring straight ahead. Then her breath hitched, once hard, and the sound of it, involuntary and unguarded, was the sound of something that had been compressed for a very long time, suddenly finding the space to release. "Emily," I reached over and put my hand on her arm. She pressed her free hand over her mouth. Her shoulders shook. Tears ran down her face in the sudden, uncontrolled way they come, when the body decides it is finally safe enough to feel what it has been carrying. "I was so scared," she said behind her hand. Her voice broke apart on the last word and reassembled itself badly. "Dad, I was so scared for so long, and I didn't know how to tell you without making everything worse, and I just kept thinking, if I could hold on a little longer, if I could just get enough." "You held on," I said. "You got enough, and you're out now." She pressed her hand harder against her mouth. Her whole body shook with the effort of what she was feeling, and not entirely succeeding in controlling, and I kept my hand on her arm and drove, and did not try to make it stop, because some things need to come out at their own speed, and the best thing another person can do is simply stay. By the time we crossed into Pasadena, her breathing had evened out. She lowered her hand. She looked at me with swollen eyes and a face that was wrecked in the specific way that faces look after a very long time of being held together finally ends. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Daniel's," I said. "You're going to sleep in a real bed tonight in a safe house, and tomorrow we're going to finish this." She nodded. She turned back to the window. Outside, the San Gabriel Mountains were a dark shape against a darker sky, and the city spread out below them in its millions of lit windows, indifferent and enormous and entirely unaware that somewhere in its middle a father had just brought his daughter home. Daniel's porch light was on when we pulled into his driveway. He was standing in the doorway before I cut the engine, a tall, unhurried shape in the light from inside, one hand resting on the doorframe, the other holding a mug of something hot. He had clearly not slept. He also clearly did not intend to make anything about that. "Emily," he said when she came up the front steps. His voice was the particular kind of quiet that holds a great deal of warmth without making a production of it. I made up the back bedroom. There's a towel on the bed and a toothbrush still in the packaging on the sink. Emily stopped on the top step and looked at him. This man she had met perhaps 6 or 7 times over the course of her life. Her father's oldest friend, standing in the middle of the night with a porch light on and a made-up bed waiting, and something moved across her face that she couldn't quite hold back. Her chin dropped, her eyes filled. "Thank you," she said. The words came out thin and cracked at the edges. Daniel just nodded the way men of his generation nod when they want to say something they consider too important to rush. "Come inside, it's cold." We sat at Daniel's kitchen table, the same kitchen table where he had been sitting the last time I had arrived at this house in the middle of the night, 30 years ago, when my business was failing and Margaret was pregnant, and I had driven here at 2 in the morning because I had run out of places to put what I was feeling. He had made coffee then too. He made it now without asking. Emily wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the table for a long moment. Then she looked up. "How much do you need to know?" she asked. "Everything," Daniel said. "But only what you're ready to say tonight. The rest can wait." She nodded once, and then she began. She talked for nearly an hour. She talked about the first year of her marriage, which had been good, in the way that things can be good when you do not yet know what is underneath them. She talked about the point, roughly 14 months ago, when something had shifted in Mark, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to and said that is the moment, but gradually the way weather changes. He had started making small comments about her judgment, offhand observations delivered lightly that left her wondering afterward whether she had misread a situation at work, mishandled a conversation, missed something obvious that everyone else had seen. "He never raised his voice," she said. Her own voice was steady and careful, the voice of someone who has rehearsed the facts in their own head. So many times they have learned to present them without flinching. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He never once raised his voice. It was always very calm, very reasonable. He would say things like, "I just want to make sure you're seeing this clearly, because sometimes when you're stressed, you have a tendency to misinterpret things." And I would think, do I? Is that true? And then I would spend the next 3 days going back over whatever had happened, trying to figure out if he was right. I felt my jaw tighten and made myself keep my face still. "He isolated you," Daniel said. "It was not a question. He said it the way a doctor names a condition, not to alarm, but to be precise." "Yes." Emily's fingers tightened around her mug. Slowly. "He had reasons for everything. My college friends were a bad influence. My work colleagues were creating unnecessary stress. My therapist, I had been seeing someone for 2 years before we got married. He said she was reinforcing negative thought patterns and he thought I should stop." She paused. I stopped. The kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of the refrigerator and the distant movement of the Pasadena night outside. "Emily," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended. "Why didn't you call me?" She looked at me, and what was in her eyes was not blame and not resentment. It was something much harder to look at, a kind of exhausted honesty that comes from a person who has spent a very long time pretending to be fine. "Because he had a version of you too," she said. "He said you were controlling, that you had never really let go of the company, that you resented me for taking it in a direction you didn't control, that you were looking for reasons to undermine our marriage because you couldn't stand not being the most important person in my life." She pressed her lips together. He said it so many times and so calmly that there were days I almost believed it. And then I would catch myself believing it and feel so ashamed that I couldn't talk to you because I didn't want you to know I'd ever thought it was true. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate. And I had learned long ago that the instinct to fill silence with words is sometimes just the instinct to make yourself feel better at the expense of the person who needs to be heard. She turned her hand over and gripped mine, and her fingers were cold from the mug and shaking slightly, and I held on. The files on the USB, she continued after a moment. I found the first one by accident 7 months ago, a transfer record that didn't match the supplier account I was reconciling. I thought it was a data entry error. I went back to check and it wasn't. She straightened slightly in her chair. After that, I started looking deliberately. I used my personal laptop and my personal accounts, nothing connected to the company system, because Kevin managed that and I didn't trust it. It took me 4 months to build what was on that drive. 4 months of checking things at 2 in the morning when Mark was asleep, then hiding the laptop in my car, then moving it to my office at the company when I realized he'd started going through my car. Daniel had his legal pad out. He was writing without looking down at it, his eyes on Emily's face. The morning Victoria came, Emily said. Her voice shifted slightly a different register, something flatter and more controlled, the way people speak about things they have not yet fully processed. I had just found the conservatorship documents. In a folder on the shared home network, she must have sent them to Mark's home computer and not realized I had access. They were draft filings, a petition to have me declared legally incapacitated on the grounds of psychiatric instability. Her jaw tightened. There were notes from a psychologist I have never met, documenting symptoms I have never had. The evaluation was dated 3 weeks earlier. The word hung in the kitchen air like something solid. "That's when she found you looking," Daniel said. "That's when she found me looking?" Emily confirmed. "She came into the study. I didn't hear her on the stairs. And then," she stopped, took a breath. "And then you knocked the door and Dad." I looked at my daughter across Daniel's kitchen table. She was 38 years old, and she was sitting with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug in the middle of the night in her father's friend's house with everything she owned in a laptop bag on the chair beside her. And she met my eyes without flinching, and what I saw in her face was not defeat. It was the particular quality of a person who has been through something terrible and come out the other side of it still standing, still themselves, still there. "You did good," I said. "Every part of it. You hear me?" She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and something in her shoulders released. Daniel set down his pen. "I'm going to contact the FBI Los Angeles field office in the morning," he said. "What Emily found on those conservatorship documents is obstruction of justice on top of everything else. We have wire fraud, trade secret theft, witness intimidation, and now preparation of fraudulent medical documentation to interfere with a potential witness." He looked at Emily. "You need to sleep. Both of you do. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Emily stood. She picked up her laptop bag. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped and turned back. "Dad." Her voice was quiet. "Thank you for the knock." I smiled for the first time in what felt like a very long time. "You taught me that knock," I said. The corner of her mouth pulled up, not quite a smile, but close enough. Then she went down the hall, and I heard the bedroom door close softly behind her. Daniel and I sat at the table. He refilled his coffee. Outside, the first faint suggestion of gray was beginning at the edges of the Pasadena sky. My phone rang. Unknown number. I looked at Daniel. He nodded. I answered. "Mr. Miller." A woman's voice, precise, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone accustomed to delivering significant information without inflection. "My name is Special Agent Rachel Torres, FBI Los Angeles Field Office. I understand you've been looking into Apex Interiors." A pause. "So, have we? And I think it's time we talked." The FBI's Los Angeles Field Office sat on Wilshire Boulevard, 11 blocks from the building, with my name on the directory. I had driven past it hundreds of times without once thinking about what happened inside. That morning, walking through the security checkpoint with Daniel beside me and a visitor badge clipped to my jacket, I thought about it quite a lot. Special Agent Rachel Torres met us in a conference room on the 4th floor. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from discipline, the practiced economy of someone who has learned to spend her energy only where it produces results. She shook my hand once firmly, and then Daniel's, and then she sat down across from us and opened a manila folder without preamble. 8 months ago, she said, we opened an investigation into Apex Interiors based on a tip from a manufacturer in San Diego who believed his company's proprietary bid structures had been stolen and used by a competitor. The tip led us to a pattern. Apex Interiors had been acquiring intellectual property from mid-sized manufacturers across California and Nevada for at least 4 years using the same methodology each time an inside recruit, a shell company payment structure, and a legal mechanism to neutralize the source company's leadership before the theft was discovered. She looked at me steadily. Miller Woodcraft is the largest target they have attempted, and Victoria Grayson is the most consistent element we have found across every case. My chest tightened. How many companies? 7 that we have confirmed, possibly more. Torres turned a page in her folder. Mrs. Grayson is not a passive participant in this operation. She identifies the targets, she recruits the internal assets, and she arranges the legal architecture. Her son handles the financial execution. She has been doing this in various forms for the better part of a decade. Daniel leaned forward. The wiretap is spams. We obtained a Title III warrant for Mark Grayson's primary cell phone in June of this year. Torres said it the way she said everything, precisely without decoration. 3 months of recorded calls. He discussed the Miller Woodcraft operation in considerable detail. He discussed the incapacity filing. He discussed your daughter. A pause, brief and exact. He also discussed on 2 occasions conversations he had with his mother about ensuring that Emily would not be in a position to cause problems after the company transition was complete. The air in the room felt different after she said that. I want to be direct with you, Mr. Miller, Torres continued. The wiretap recordings are sealed evidence in a federal criminal investigation. They cannot be used in civil proceedings, not in a shareholder meeting, not in a boardroom. What you can use in those settings is the documentary evidence your daughter collected and the access logs your assistant provided. Those are yours. The recordings are ours, and they stay in our case file until trial. She closed the folder. What we need from you is cooperation and timing. We are not ready to move yet. We need you to give us a controlled environment in which to make the arrest, somewhere we can be present without alerting the subjects beforehand. The annual shareholder meeting, Daniel said. Torres looked at him. That was our thought as well. I sat with that for a moment. The fluorescent light in the conference room was the flat, indifferent kind that makes everything look slightly more serious than it already is. Outside the window, Wilshire Boulevard was doing its ordinary morning business, and 11 blocks away was a building with my name on it that I was currently not allowed to enter. There is one more thing, Torres said. She reached into the folder and placed a photograph on the table between us. It was a candid shot, slightly grainy in the way of photographs taken from a distance with a long lens. A hotel lobby or event space, marble floors, people in formal clothing moving in the background. In the foreground, 2 people stood close together, in the attitude of people who know each other well and are comfortable showing it. One of them was a man I did not recognize, heavy-set, silver-haired, expensive suit. The other was Victoria Grayson. That photograph was taken in Manhattan, Torres said. September of 2022, the man with Mrs. Grayson is the CEO of Apex Interiors. She let that land. 2 years before your daughter married Mark Grayson? I stared at the photograph. 2 years. Before the wedding, before Mark had come to work at Miller Woodcraft, before any of it. Victoria had been standing in a Manhattan hotel with the chief executive of the company that would receive stolen Miller Woodcraft designs 2 years before a single piece of the operation had been put into place. The marriage had not been a coincidence. Emily's relationship with Mark had not been something that had simply happened. It had been a door opened deliberately by someone who had already decided what she intended to walk through it. My hand was flat on the conference table. I could feel the edge of the photograph under my fingertips. She planned this before Emily and Mark ever met, I said. That is our assessment, Torres said. I looked up from the photograph. Torres was watching me with the particular attention of someone who has delivered difficult information many times and knows that what the other person does in the next few seconds tells you a great deal about who they are. I picked up the photograph. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I set it back down. Tell me what you need me to do, I said. Torres almost smiled. It was a very small almost. Give her a reason to believe she's already won, she said. Can you do that? I thought about a garage in Pasadena, about 41 years, about the name pressed into the concrete floor. Yes, I said, I can do that. The call to the corporate secretary took 4 minutes. I placed it from the parking garage beneath the FBI building, still holding the visitor badge in my hand, while Daniel stood beside the truck and drank the last of a coffee he had carried out of the building. I identified myself, confirmed that I held 51% of Miller Woodcraft's founding shares, a fact that neither Mark nor Victoria had apparently considered significant enough to act on before the board vote, which told me something important about the limits of Victoria's legal knowledge and requested that the annual shareholder meeting be scheduled for the first week of November. The secretary confirmed. She sounded nervous. I thanked her and ended the call. 6 weeks, Daniel said. 6 weeks, I agreed. 6 weeks of becoming the man they wanted me to be. I started the following Monday. I arrived at my scheduled board appearance. I was still permitted to attend in an advisory capacity despite the suspension, 17 minutes late, which I had never once been in 40 years. I forgot the name of a supplier I had worked with for a decade and a half. I repeated a point I had made 10 minutes earlier, as though I had not made it. I watched Richard Hale watch me from across the table, with the expression of a man checking items off a list. Sandra reported the next day that Mark had called her into his office. He had asked her carefully, and with great apparent concern, whether she had noticed any changes in my behavior recently, whether I seemed confused at times, whether she thought the stress of the investigation might be affecting my cognitive function. Sandra had told him that she was worried about me actually, and that she had mentioned it to my doctor at my last checkup, and that she thought I might be pushing myself too hard. When she told me this, sitting in her car in the parking structure at a grocery store in Burbank where we had agreed to meet, her hands were gripping the steering wheel, even though the car was parked and the engine was off. I hated every word of it, she said. Her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright, with a controlled fury that I had never seen from her in 22 years. I hated saying it. I know, I said. You did it exactly right. She let out a breath through her nose. He believed me completely. He called Victoria while I was still in the building. I could hear him through the wall. Victoria? It turned out believed it too. She began appearing at public events connected to the company, a charity gala in Century City, a supplier dinner in Culver City, with the quiet confidence of a woman who has decided the outcome of something and is simply waiting for the calendar to catch up. She smiled at people. She spoke warmly about the company's future. She never once mentioned me by name. Emily stayed at Daniel's house. She worked remotely carefully on her personal laptop. She and I spoke every evening on the secondary phones, and each time I heard her voice steadier, now more solid, rebuilding itself from the inside, out with something in my chest that had been clenched for weeks, loosened slightly. Torres coordinated with Daniel twice a week. The FBI's preparation was its own architecture, careful, patient, and invisible. The night before the meeting, I went to the office. Sandra had left a spare access badge with the overnight security desk under her name, a small favor arranged quietly, the kind only a person who has worked somewhere for 22 years knows how to arrange without leaving a trace. I took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked down the empty hallway to my office. The building was quiet in the way that large buildings are quiet at night, full of the residual warmth of the day's work, and the soft sounds of systems running in the dark. I sat down at my desk. On the credenza behind me, between a small cactus Emily had given me 3 years ago, because she said I needed something in the office that could survive my schedule, and a coffee mug from a trade show in 2009 that I had never gotten around to. Throwing away, there was a photograph in a silver frame. Margaret, 1998. Standing in front of the Glendale facility on the day we signed the lease, laughing at something I had just said, her hair blowing sideways in the October wind. She had been 34 years old. She had been so entirely, completely alive. I picked up the frame. I held it in both hands. "Tomorrow," I said quietly. "I'm going to finish this tomorrow, Maggie. I promise." The cactus sat on the credenza and did not comment, which was exactly what I needed. I set the photograph down. I turned off the desk lamp. I walked back down the hallway to the elevator, and in the elevator going down, I stood very straight and kept my breathing, even the way I had learned to do in boardrooms and job sites and hospital waiting rooms over the course of 68 years, of a life that had not always been kind, but had always eventually been worth it. In the lobby, I stopped in front of the building directory. My name was still there, fourth line from the top. Thomas Miller, founder. I put 2 fingers against it briefly, Then I pushed through the glass doors and walked to my truck and drove home through the empty November streets of Los Angeles and slept better than I had in 2 months. I woke at 4:53 without an alarm. For a few minutes I lay in the dark and listened to the house, the refrigerator, a car passing on the street outside, the particular quality of silence that belongs to the hour before the city decides to start again. Then I got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky go from black to the deep gray blue that precedes November dawn in Los Angeles. At 6:15, I went to the bedroom closet and took out the suit. It was a dark navy wool, single-breasted, bought off the rack at a department store in Pasadena in the spring of 1998 and altered twice since then, once when my shoulders had broadened in my early 50s, and once 3 years ago when the tailor had looked at me over his glasses and said, without any particular judgment, that I had lost some weight and it showed. The fabric had thinned at the elbows in a way that a good dry cleaner could not entirely conceal. The lining had been replaced. Margaret had picked it out. She had walked me through 4 different suits that Saturday morning and rejected 3 of them with the focused efficiency of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking for and has limited patience for anything that falls short. She had held the 4th one up, looked at it, looked at me, and said, "That one. You'll wear that one when things matter." She had been right the way she was right about most things. I had worn it the day we signed the Glendale lease. I had worn it to her funeral. I had worn it the day Emily became CEO. I put it on carefully. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment. The man looking back at me was 68 years old, with calloused hands and gray at his temples, and 41 years of something built from nothing behind him. He looked ready. Emily arrived at 7:30 Daniel's car, pulling up to the curb in front of my house. She had borrowed a blazer from somewhere dark gray, clean lines, the kind of thing she wore when she wanted to look like exactly what she was. She came up the front walk with her laptop bag over her shoulder and her chin level, and when I opened the door, she looked at me in my suit and something moved across her face that she let herself feel for exactly 1 second before she put it away. "You found it," she said. "It was where it always is," I said. She stepped inside. I poured her coffee. We sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes without discussing what was about to happen, talking instead about small things. A book she had been reading at Daniel's, the way the light came through his back windows in the morning, whether just as a name she had given a stray cat that had appeared in Daniel's yard during her 3rd week, there would still be waiting when she went back. Normal things. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation that means something different when you are having it, because you need to remember what normal feels like before you walk into a room where everything is going to change. At 8:15, we drove to Wilshire Boulevard. The lobby of Miller Woodcraft's building was busy with the early movement of a Monday morning assistants with coffee cups, contractors with equipment cases, the ordinary industry of people who had no idea what was going to happen on the 14th floor in 45 minutes. I walked through it the way I had walked through it for 20 years. Sandra was at the elevator bank. She had arrived at 6, she told me quietly, to make sure the conference room was set correctly and that the AV system was working and that there was fresh water on the table. She pressed the elevator button and did not say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. The 14th floor corridor was quiet. We passed Victoria and Mark coming out of the small conference room at the end of the hall, Mark in a charcoal suit, Victoria in cream, her pearls, her reading glasses folded in her hand, both of them in conversation with Richard Hale, who was carrying his leather portfolio and talking in the low, unhurried way of a man who considers the outcome already settled. Mark saw me first. His expression went through several adjustments in rapid succession before landing on something that was trying to be sympathetic. "Thomas," he said, "I didn't know you were coming." "It's my meeting," I said pleasantly. "I called it." He opened his mouth, closed it. Then Victoria saw Emily. I watched it happen. Victoria's eyes moved from me to the woman standing beside me, and for one unguarded moment, one single second, in which the architecture of her composure showed its load-bearing walls, her step faltered, just slightly, just enough. Emily looked at her mother-in-law. She did not look away. She did not drop her eyes. She stood in the corridor of the 14th floor of her father's building in a borrowed gray blazer with her laptop bag on her shoulder, and she held Victoria Grayson's gaze with the steady level attention of a woman who has spent 14 months doubting herself and has come out the other side of it knowing exactly who she is. Victoria recovered. She always recovered, The composure slid back into place like a door finding its frame, and she turned to Mark and said something low that I could not hear. Mark's jaw tightened. He glanced at Emily, then back at Victoria. "You said she was handled," I heard him say barely above a breath. "She doesn't have anything that matters," Victoria murmured. "Stay composed." I had heard enough. I walked past them to the boardroom door. I put my hand on it, the solid weight of it, the brass handle I had chosen myself. When we'd had the offices renovated in 2011, I pushed it open. The boardroom smelled of coffee and fresh paper, and the particular charged quality of a room full of people who know something significant is about to happen and are not entirely sure what side of it they are going to end up on. 9 board members, 6 major shareholders. Torres and 2 of her people present as security consultants as far as anyone in the room knew. I walked to the head of the table. I pulled out my chair, the chair I had sat in for 20 years. At the head of the table I had made with my own hands from a single slab of black walnut hauled up 14 floors in an elevator. I sat down. I placed both palms flat on the surface of the wood, feeling the grain under my skin, the slight warmth of it, the weight of what it was and what it had always been. I looked around the room. Every face, every person. Then I looked at Mark and Victoria, sitting side by side at the far end of the table, with Richard Hale between them. And I thought of Margaret in the Pasadena garage saying, "Don't let go of it. You might need to remember someday." And I thought of old Emily's name pressed into the concrete floor, and I thought of a November morning in 1983 when I had stood in an empty garage with one borrowed table saw and more stubbornness than sense, and decided that I was going to build something that lasted. "Shall we begin?" I said. "Before I show you what Thomas put on that screen, the evidence that made Victoria's composure finally crack, comment the word justice below. So I know you've been here through all of it. This is the moment 41 years of work was either lost or reclaimed. Note this family betrayal story contains fictional elements crafted to carry a message worth hearing. If this type of content isn't right for you, feel free to step away, and thank you for making it this far." Victoria stood up first. She had dressed for this the way generals dress for surrender ceremonies, immaculately deliberately, with the calm authority of someone who has decided that appearance is its own form of argument. She thanked the board for their time. She thanked the shareholders for their patience during what she called a difficult period of transition. She used the word stewardship 4 times in the first 3 minutes, which told me she had rehearsed this. I sat at the head of the table and listened and did not move. Mark sat to her left, his hands folded on the table, his expression arranged into something between gravity and reluctant duty. Richard Hale sat beside him with his portfolio open and a series of laminated documents stacked in a neat row, each one tabbed with a colored marker. They had prepared thoroughly. I gave them that. Victoria worked through the presentation with the methodical confidence of a woman who believes she is the most intelligent person in any room she occupies. She presented the falsified email records, my name, my supposed communications with Apex Interiors, my alleged authorization of the design file transfers. She presented the bank records for the Nevada account I had never opened. She presented a timeline printed on heavy cardstock, charting what she described as a pattern of deliberate corporate misconduct, stretching back 14 months. She did not look at me once while she spoke. Halfway through, I noticed Gerald Whitmore watching me from across the table. Not the way he had watched me at the first meeting, avoiding my eyes studying the wall. Watching me directly with the careful attention of a man who has begun to wonder whether he made the right decision 6 weeks ago, and is looking for information that will answer the question one way or the other. I met his gaze briefly, and then looked back at Victoria, and I kept my face exactly as it had been, still attentive, giving nothing away. Mark spoke when Victoria finished. He talked about his reluctance, his respect for everything I had built, his sorrow at what the evidence compelled him to conclude. His voice cracked once cleanly on the word integrity, and I watched 2 of the shareholders shift in their seats with the discomfort of people witnessing something they believe is genuine and wish they weren't. The performance was very good. It had always been very good. Victoria concluded with a motion to formalize my removal as chairman and transfer operational authority to a committee pending legal resolution. She looked around the table. She smiled briefly with the satisfaction of a woman crossing the final item off a very long list. "Does anyone wish to speak before we proceed to the vote?" she asked. "Yes," I said. The room went very quiet. I had not spoken a single word in 40 minutes. The silence had been deliberate. I had wanted every person in that room to see a man sitting patiently through his own destruction. Because patience is either the behavior of someone who has accepted defeat or someone who is waiting for the right moment, and I needed them to assume the former until I showed them the latter. I stood up. "May I have the floor?" Victoria's smile held. "Of course, Thomas. Please." I picked up the small remote control Sandra had placed beside my water glass when she'd set the room that morning. I pointed it at the screen behind me. "I'd like to share some documents," I said. "I'll try to be brief." The first slide was the email chain between Mark and Victoria, not the fabricated version they had presented, but the real one recovered from Emily's personal archive and verified by Daniel's forensic analysis. Complete with metadata. Complete with timestamps. Complete with the server path showing origin and destination. The email in which Mark wrote, "Make sure Hale has everything he needs before the board meeting," sat in large print at the center of the screen. Nobody spoke. The second slide was the access log from Sandra's archive system. Device ID ending in 8842. March 14th. 3:47 in the morning. 47 proprietary design files downloaded to an external drive from a residential IP address registered to a property in Beverly Hills. Gerald Whitmore leaned forward in his chair. The third slide was the bank record for GV Holdings' Grand Cayman transactions, totaling over $800,000 routed through a Delaware shell company, paid to an account whose initials corresponded to the two people sitting at the far end of my table. The fourth slide was Kevin Parsons' cooperation agreement with the federal government executed 3 weeks earlier, in which he provided a detailed account of every instruction he had received, every system he had accessed, and every piece of false documentation he had created at Mark Grayson's direction. Mark's hands came apart on the table. Victoria's expression did not change, but her color did. The composed cream and pearl certainty of it went slowly over the course of about 15 seconds, to something that was not quite gray but was heading there. I advanced to the fifth slide and let it speak for itself. "The documents Mrs. Grayson presented today were fabricated," I said. "The email records the bank account, the digital signatures, all of them were created by an IT employee acting under Mark Grayson's instruction, and all of them have been provided to the relevant federal authorities, along with a full cooperation statement." I set the remote down on the table. Miller Woodcraft's proprietary design files were stolen and sold to a competitor. The people who did it are in this room, and they have been under federal investigation for the past 8 months. Mark stood up. His chair scraped back hard against the floor, and his face had gone a color I had never seen on it before. Not anger, not fear exactly, but the specific expression of a man watching a structure he built collapse and realizing for the first time that he is standing inside it. "This is fabricated," he said. His voice came out thin and wrong. "All of it. You can't, this is Dad. You have to understand that what he's done here." The boardroom door opened. I did not turn around. I did not need to. Special Agent Rachel Torres walked into the boardroom, the way she did everything without announcement, without theater, with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have learned that authority does not require performance. 2 agents followed her. They positioned themselves without being directed, one near the door, one to the left of the table, and the room understood immediately what was happening even before Torres opened her mouth. She looked at Mark first. "Mark Grayson," she said. Her voice was the same voice she had used in the conference room 2 months ago, precise, unhurried, carrying no more weight than the facts required. "You are under arrest for wire fraud in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343, and for theft of trade secrets in violation of the Defend Trade Secrets Act. You have the right to remain silent." Mark's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Torres was already moving around the table. "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Mark looked at Victoria. His eyes were wide and very young. Suddenly the eyes of a man who has spent years constructing a version of himself that cannot be frightened, discovering in a single moment that the construction was not as solid as he believed. "Mom," he said. Just that. Just the words stripped of everything else. Victoria did not look at him. She was looking at me. The composure was still there, I will give her that. Even now, even in this room, with federal agents at the door, and 40 years of someone else's work spread across the screen behind her, Victoria Grayson held herself with the posture of a woman who has decided that dignity is the last thing left to her and intends to keep it. Her pearls were straight, her hands were still, her chin was level, but her eyes were doing something I had never seen them do in 4 years of Sunday dinners and company events and careful calibrated conversations. They were moving from me to Emily to the screen to Torres and back to me, with the rapid involuntary movement of a person whose interior calculations are no longer producing usable results. Torres reached her. "Victoria Grayson, you are under arrest for wire fraud conspiracy to commit theft of trade secrets and witness intimidation in violation of federal law. You have the right to remain silent." Victoria's chin lifted slightly. "I want my attorney," she said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. "I will not say another word without my attorney present." "That is your right," Torres said. The handcuffs were a sound I will remember for the rest of my life. Not loud, not dramatic, just a clean mechanical click that carried across the silence of the room, the way a period carries across the end of a very long sentence. Richard Hale was already on his feet. He had closed his portfolio and picked up his briefcase and was moving toward the door with the focused, unhurried pace of a man who is not under arrest and intends to remain that way. He did not look at Victoria. He did not look at Mark. He did not look at me. Emily appeared at my shoulder. I had not seen her cross the room. She was simply there the way she had been there her whole life, quietly without announcement, at the exact moment she was needed. Her hand found my arm and held it, and I put my hand over hers, and we stood together at the head of the table while the room moved around us. I looked at Mark. He was standing with his wrists behind him, his expensive suit still perfectly pressed his face, doing something complicated and private that I did not feel I had the right to examine too closely. He was 41 years old. He had walked into my company 8 years ago with a sharp mind and good manners, and something underneath both of those things that I had felt but not named. And I had given him everything I would have given a son, and he had used it to try to take everything I had built. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was the specific heavy sorrow of a man who trusted someone and was wrong, and who knows that being wrong about a person is not the same as being weak, but carries some of the same weight regardless. "I gave you everything," I said. My voice came out low and even. "And this is what you did with it." Mark looked at me. His throat moved. He did not speak. Victoria was being guided toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped the agent with her, did not prevent. It gave her the half-second she seemed to need, and she turned and looked at Emily. "She was never strong enough for this," Victoria said. Her voice was quiet and precise, the voice of a woman delivering a final assessment she has complete confidence in. She never was. Emily's hand tightened on my arm. I looked at my daughter. She was standing straight, her chin level, her eyes clear. She had heard those words, or some version of them, before I understood that now understanding everything I understood now, and she was still standing. "No," I said. I looked at Victoria. "She's mine." Victoria held my gaze for one more second. Then Torres said something quiet to the agent beside her, and they moved, and Victoria Grayson was gone from the room. The door closed. The boardroom was very quiet. Gerald Whitmore had his hands flat on the table and was staring at the surface of it with the expression of a man taking an accounting of himself. Several of the other board members were speaking in low voices. Someone had their phone out. Sandra was standing near the window. When she caught my eye, she pressed her lips together and nodded once, the small, definitive nod of a woman who did the right thing and knows it and does not require anything further to be said about it. I looked at Emily. She looked at me. Her eyes were bright with tears. She was not going to let fall. Not here, not in this room, and her jaw was set with the particular determination of a woman who has been told she is not strong enough for something and has just spent the last 2 months proving otherwise. Her hand was still on my arm. Her grip had not loosened once. "It's done," I said. She nodded. Her chin trembled once and then steadied. "It's done," she said. "If you believe that strength is not about never being afraid, but about what you do, when you are, leave the word strong in the comments. And if this story has meant something to you, subscribe so you never miss what comes next." The weeks that followed moved differently than the weeks before had. Before time had the quality of something being wound too tight each day, adding another turn to a tension that had no place to go. After it unwound, not quickly, not cleanly, but with the gradual uneven release of something that has been under pressure for a long time, and needs to find its own pace back to level. The federal charges were filed 11 days after the arrest: wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code, theft of trade secrets under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, embezzlement under California Penal Code, Section 503, witness intimidation. The indictment ran to 31 pages, and Torres called me, the morning it was filed, to tell me that the prosecution intended to seek additional counts as the investigation expanded. She said it in the same unhurried voice she used for everything, and I thanked her and sat in my kitchen for a few minutes afterward, drinking cold coffee and feeling something I did not immediately have a name for. It was not relief exactly. Relief implies that the danger was something that happened to you from outside. This had been something that happened from inside, from people I had brought in and trusted and made room for at my table, and the removal of it left a shape in the air where they had been. Kevin Parsons entered a cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutor's office and was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, no prison time. He had provided everything: text messages, instruction logs, his own meticulous records of what he had been asked to do and by whom, and the prosecutor had honored the agreement in full. I did not feel anger toward Kevin. I had examined that question carefully, turned it over the way you turn a piece of wood to find the grain, and what I found underneath the betrayal was something more complicated than anger. He had been 29 years old when Mark recruited him. He had made a catastrophic decision for reasons that were not entirely different from the reasons anyone makes catastrophic decisions. He had wanted to matter to someone who seemed to know how the world worked, and he had not understood until it was too late that the price of that was going to be paid entirely by him. Richard Hale received a notice of formal investigation from the California State Bar 3 weeks after the arrest. His practice was suspended pending the outcome of the disciplinary proceedings. I heard from Sandra, who heard from someone in the Century City legal community, that he had begun the process of negotiating a voluntary surrender of his license. I did not follow up on this. It was not my proceeding to follow. Apex Interiors was raided by the FBI in the second week of December. Their assets were frozen. The investigation expanded to cover 6 additional companies across California and Nevada that had experienced similar patterns of intellectual property theft over the preceding 4 years. Torres told me at a brief meeting in January that the case was becoming one of the larger corporate espionage prosecutions the Los Angeles field office had handled in a decade. She said this without particular pride, the way she said everything as though facts were simply facts, and did not require her emotional endorsement to be significant. Miller Woodcraft's stolen design files, 47 of them, the ones Mark had downloaded at 3:47 in the morning while the building slept, were identified in Apex Interiors systems during the raid and flagged for civil recovery. Our attorneys filed a civil action in December, and by February we had a court order restoring full ownership. The Coastal Contract Series, the Miller Heritage Collection, the modular system for the Downtown Hotel project, all of it back where it belonged. Emily filed for divorce in November, 2 weeks after the arrest. The proceedings were what divorce proceedings involving a man under federal indictment tend to be: complicated, slow, and occasionally surprising in ways that nobody anticipated. The first surprise came in January when Emily's attorney contacted me to ask whether I had known that Mark had taken out a life insurance policy on Emily 18 months earlier. I had not known. The policy was for $2 million. Mark was the sole beneficiary. It had been purchased quietly through a broker in Nevada, with no prior connection to either of them, paid for with funds routed through one of the same shell company structures used for the Apex Interiors payments. Emily's attorney flagged it immediately and referred it to Torres, who opened a separate line of investigation that she described to me at a meeting in February as moving in a direction she could not yet discuss. I did not ask her to elaborate. I sat across from her in the FBI conference room on Wilshire Boulevard, and I thought about my daughter living in that house in Beverly Hills for 14 months, with a man who had decided at some point in that time that she was worth more to him as a policy than as a person. And I thought about all the evenings I had called her on the secondary phone and heard her voice getting steadier, rebuilding itself. And I understood that the steadiness had not come from nothing. It had come from a person who was stronger than everything that had been done to her, and who had survived it, and who was still here. "She's going to be all right," Daniel said. We were sitting on his back porch in Pasadena on a Thursday evening in March, the kind of evening where the air has finally decided to stop pretending it is still winter. He had a beer, I had a beer. The neighborhood made its quiet evening sounds around us. Yes, I said. She is. And you? I thought about the question. It deserved an honest answer, and Daniel was the kind of person who would know if I gave him a dishonest one. I'm getting there, I said. He nodded. He looked out at the yard where the light was going, gold in the way it goes in the San Gabriel Valley in early spring, and he said nothing further because we had known each other long enough that some answers do not require a response to be complete. Emily called that evening after I got home. She sounded like herself, the self that had existed before, 14 months of someone else's hands on the shape of her. The self I recognized from 1,000 ordinary conversations in a life we had been building together since the day she was born. The hotel project is back on, she said. The developer called this morning. He wants to move forward with the modular system. The one from the Heritage Collection. Modified. I've been working on some changes. A pause, and I could hear in it the particular quality of someone who has been thinking about something for a while and is ready to say it. Dad, I want to rebuild the company, not restore it, rebuild it. New clients, new markets, some things we've never tried. I have ideas. I sat down at my kitchen table. Outside the window, the Santa Monica evening was doing what it always does, indifferent and enormous and entirely sufficient. Tell me, I said, and she did. 6 months after the arrest, I drove back to Pasadena. It was a Saturday in May, the kind of morning that reminds you why people live in Southern California. The air clean after 2 days of rain, the San Gabriel Mountains sharp against a sky that had decided, at least for today, to be exactly the blue it was capable of being. I drove with the windows down and the radio off and my hands easy on the wheel, and for the first time in longer than I could accurately calculate, I was not thinking about anything in particular. The garage on Colorado Boulevard had been my idea. A small museum, a single room telling the story of where Miller Woodcraft had started. Emily had designed it. Sandra had organized the archive. It had opened in March quietly without a press release, and in the 2 months since, a steady trickle of employees and longtime clients had found their way there to stand in the space where it had all begun and look at the photographs on the wall and the tools in the glass case, and the original lease agreement framed with my own signature at the bottom, in the careful cursive of a younger man who believed that a signature was a promise. I parked out front and sat in the truck for a moment. Daniel's car was already there. Through the garage's single window, I could see the light on inside and the shape of him moving around, and I felt the particular warmth that comes from knowing that certain people will simply always be where you need them to be. I went inside. He was standing near the old workbench, holding 2 bottles of beer by their necks, and he held one out without ceremony when I came through the door. I took it. We stood together in the space that smelled exactly as it always had, sawdust and oil and the dry warmth of decades. And we did not need to say anything about what the place meant because we had both been here long enough to know. Emily arrived 20 minutes later. Behind her came Daniel's granddaughter Lily, 4 years old, dark-haired, regarding the garage with the wide, serious attention of a child encountering something she has decided requires careful study. Daniel's son had dropped her off that morning, and none of us had objected. Emily set her down, and Lily walked immediately to the east wall and put both hands flat against it, feeling the surface the way children touch things they find interesting. I watched her. She was standing almost exactly where Margaret had knelt 41 years ago to press Emily's name into the wet concrete floor. My chest tightened in a way that was not pain. I reached into my jacket pocket. The velvet pouch was there. It had been there since morning, since I had taken it from the dresser drawer, where it had sat since the day I drove to Beverly Hills, and everything changed. Emily, I said. She turned. I held out the pouch. She took it carefully, the way you take something you understand is being given, with its full weight behind it. She opened it. She lifted the watch out the Omega Seamaster, scratched crystal replaced band, the movement still running, clean and true, and turned it over in her hands. On the inside of the case, back where I had taken it to be engraved 12 years ago, the words were still clear, to the one who carries it forward. Dad. Emily's face broke open, and what was underneath was not sorrow, but something much larger, something that had room for everything. The years, the loss, the danger, the survival, the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of still being here together, in this room where everything had started. She pressed the watch against her chest with both hands. Her shoulders shook. I stepped forward and held on, the way I had held on to things my whole life. Not perfectly not, without cost, but without letting go. After a while, she pulled back. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at me with eyes that were red and clear and completely entirely hers. Lily had found the name in the concrete floor. She was crouching over it, tracing the letters with one small finger, her face tilted up toward mine. "Mr. Miller," she said. "What's this?" I crouched down beside her. "That's Emily's name," I said. "Someone who loved her very much put it there a long time ago, so she would always have a place here." Lily considered this seriously. Then she looked up. "Will you put my name too?" I looked at Emily. She was watching us with the watch still held against her chest, and her face was wearing the expression a person wears when they understand in the fullest sense that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. I looked back at Lily. "Yes," I said. "I will." Daniel cracked his beer open behind us, and the sound of it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and I was grateful for it, beyond any reasonable measure. I had built something from nothing. I had almost lost it. I had gotten it back. Victoria Grayson had thought that age made a man weak. She had forgotten something that every carpenter learns early: the older the wood, the harder it is to break. I reached for Daniel's beer, took a long pull, and handed it back. Then I got up and went to find something to write with. I am Thomas Miller, and this has been my story. Looking back, I understand something now that I wish I had understood sooner. The people who want to take what you have built will almost always come from inside your own table, not from strangers, but from the ones you fed, trusted, and called family. That is the nature of family betrayal. It does not announce itself. It arrives wearing the face of love. My advice to you is simple. Watch not what people say, but what they do when they believe no one is looking. I almost lost everything because I extended trust without asking for evidence. Do not make my mistake. I believe that a man's life is not measured by what he accumulates, but by what he refuses to surrender. And I believe I know that God does not abandon a father who fights with clean hands for his children. This has been a family story about what it costs to build something real and what it means to protect it. Every family story worth telling has a moment where everything could go either way. Mine had several. I am grateful I was still standing when it was over. If something in this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that loyalty and love are still worth fighting for, subscribe to this channel. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements created for the purpose of entertainment and reflection. If this type of content is not for you, we respect that completely and invite you to find what speaks to your heart elsewhere.